Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. We have expanded our gallery. It's free to visit with no need to book a ticket. Over the next few months, we'll be exploring some of the fascinating objects we now have on display, from alchemical scrolls and battlefield medicine at Culloden to bloodletting and homeopathy. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. And please do pay a visit to our gallery when you're next in Edinburgh. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, I'm Daisy Cunynghame, and I am the Heritage Manager at the Physicians Gallery.
And I'm Rachel Forrest. I'm the Heritage Engagement Coordinator at the Physicians Gallery.
And our object today, or slightly cheating, two objects, are two bleeding bowls, both from around the late 1800s. It's slightly difficult to say. So just to start by describing the objects. So these are two different bowls. They're about the same size. And I always struggle with dimensions. So I've gone with about half the size of a standard clock.
I feel like your measurements are getting more and more bizarre, but I like it.
I've also come up with the size of a typical cereal bowl, but I'm not sure there is like a standard size. But so it's that size. Picture a clock, picture half of a clock. It's one of those.
Yeah, I actually think the clock is better. I think
Okay.
the clock tells me more about the size of the bowl.
Thank you very much. So they are both round. They're both fairly shallow bowls, and they look quite different. Although they are the same size and kind of the same shape, they look quite different. One of them is in pretty pristine condition. It's made of brass. It's very shiny. It's very untarnished, so there's no kind of scrapes or cuts. It has a large lip around it and an oval cutout or a notch in the side of it. And if that sounds confusing, don't worry, we'll come back to it. It doesn't have any sort of handle. So it's this very brass, shiny, clean looking object. And the other bowl is made of pewter. So it's silver colored metal, but it's definitely not silver. And this is very battered. It's got all kinds of notches and cuts and bangs and all that to it. And it doesn't have a rim, but it has a handle which is sort of in the shape of a Celtic knot. So one very, very shiny, very clean, one very sort of damaged and clearly very well used. So these are both bleeding bowls. The first one may never have been used. It's entirely possible that the brass one was just completely ornamental. And the rim that I mentioned, with the cutout in it, there's a couple of different reasons why that might have been added. One of which is to rest a person's arm. So if you're being bled and you're being bled into this bowl, you could rest your arm in that kind of oval. So it's sort of an arm-shaped oval, I suppose. So your blood would run into the bowl. Another version is to rest the lancet or the scalpel, the blade in to stop the blood from just getting everywhere. Or it's for a surgeon to hold on to. So if you picture a stereotypical image in your head of an artist painting and holding like a painter's palette, it's sort of like that. It's a nook to hold on to. But it's that nook that shows you this isn't just a normal bowl. The pewter bowl, the kind of battered bowl, is what's called a porringer. Now, a porringer is sort of a bowl or dish, and the handles mean they can be hung up. So you'll see in quite a lot of illustrations of kitchens from the sort of 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, little bowls like this being hung up in the kitchen. And they're just there as a convenient tool. They're made of all sorts of things, pottery, iron, wood. And in a poor person's household in particular, porringers were these very, very multi-use tools. So you might eat stew out of it, you might well have porridge out of it, and that's where the name comes from, porridge and porringer. But yeah, you'd have soup out of it, you'd use it as a measuring tool and as a gravy boat and as a ladle. So it was a very like multi-use object. But it was also, like this one, used for bloodletting. So I found a porringer quote from a surgeon in 1617, and this is the quote: "Blood porringers are necessary at sea to be the more certain of the quantity of blood which is taken, since the blood of a man is so precious a thing."
Oh, so they were using it as a measurement device. 1 porringer of blood.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what bleeding bowls are useful for in general, that you can keep track of how much blood you're taking out of a person, and they would often have measurements up the side of the bowl. But obviously they, like I say, they were really multi-use tools, so it was great to have one because you could use it for bloodletting and then rinse it out and use it for a gravy boat.
I mean, that's quite disgusting. The porringer creeps me out a bit more than the bleeding bowl, just because it's like designed to be used for bloodletting and eating out of.
Yeah, I think bleeding bowls, what you will find is the kind of the brass bleeding bowl with a notch in it look pretty much exactly the same as barbers' shaving bowls. And again, that comes back to the history of the fact that, barbers in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s were the people who were bloodletting. And then you get what were called barber surgeons who were taking on even more of that medical role. And then they kind of separate out into surgeons as we know them now. There's not really a crossover between those bleeding bowls and food, which is nice, as you say. But there is a crossover definitely with barbers. And so that nook in the side, that little kind of cut in, which can be used to kind of hold your lancet, could also be used to hold your razor when you are shaving your. So they would be multi-purpose, but not to be eaten out of, which definitely makes it less disgusting.
Yeah. But these are both multi-purpose bowls. They're just for multi-purpose for different people.
Yeah, I mean, it costs money to make things, and unless you're very wealthy, you probably don't have a special fork just for eating oysters or something. You probably do have a sort of multi-purpose tool, and absolutely that this is what it would be used for. But yeah, shaving and bleeding feel like more natural bedfellows.
You mentioned that it was really common to have porringers at home. Was it common for them to be used for bleeding at home?
It's difficult to say for sure because it's always the case that poorer people tend to have less records,
Yeah.
less information is saved about them. My assumption based on what I know is that your average, just normal everyday person would not be bloodletting at home, but there would be people in the community who would. So you'd get your local church minister, your local blacksmith, your local healer. So there would be people who were not qualified physicians or surgeons who would be bloodletting, and they would be using porringers. But it isn't like every laborer in the field or every housewife would be doing that.
Okay. But that was obviously so normal to go to your blacksmith or your minister to be bloodlet. But for us now, that's bizarre. We would never seek medical treatment with a blacksmith or with a minister.
I mean, absolutely not.
Like, we just wouldn't do that.
But I think there's also, even in more remote and rural places, there is still much better access to healthcare now. If there isn't a physician, there may be a nurse, there may be somebody qualified. Whereas a lot of the time when people are going to blacksmiths, it's not when they're in the big cities, it's when they're in rural places where there is no doctor.
Yeah. And was it because they were the people with the tools or they were the people that were trusted?
I'm not going to pretend I know 100% for sure, but I would say it's a combination of they are people who are adept at working with their hands, much like
Mhm.
barbers
Yeah.
be thought of as people who were good with working with their hands. But blacksmiths also have a slightly different status. You find in a lot of early folk healing that blacksmiths come up a lot. So it's not even always to do with working with their hands. There's an idea that blacksmiths I can't remember the exact details, which is annoying, but I remember there being a number of folk healing recipes that involve people being passed under or over the anvil of a blacksmith.
Wow.
And it was part of a sort of ritual, so it wasn't to do with bleeding or using tools, it was just somehow blacksmiths were viewed as having particular abilities.
I didn't know that. That is really interesting.
They were already viewed as having a connection to medicine that other trades or other skills didn't have, and so that then perhaps led into them being associated with bloodletting as well. But the other thing about both of these bowls, as I mentioned before, they are quite shallow and wide. You wouldn't want to be bleeding someone into a champagne flute. Not that people would have champagne flutes. It's not just about measuring the quantity of blood, it's also about being able to examine the blood. And that works much better in a sort of broad, flat bowl because you want to be looking at the blood and seeing, is it particularly dark? Is it light? Is it thin? Is it thick? These are all indicators that doctors would use now, and they used them historically as well. They didn't necessarily have the same, scientific rigor to it, but they were interested in looking at the blood and trying to understand it. And so these bowls were very well suited for that.
Examining as much of the surface as possible.
Now it might be an indication of, blood being oxygenated or something like that, or blood clotting and that meaning certain things. But then it was more about, do you have too much blood in your body? Is your blood corrupted in some way? What it meant was different, but it was a useful thing to be able to do.
At this time, when they were bloodletting, were physicians or the people that weren't physicians that were doing the bloodletting, were they aware how much blood was in the human body?
That's a difficult question. First of all, bear in mind that bloodletting continued up to a point into the 20th century. It had kind of fizzled. It had become less common, but it was very common in the 1800s. So when you're talking about what people knew about blood, you're sort of asking about a kind of a 2,000-year period.
Yeah.
The level of knowledge shifted during that time frame. By the 1800s, when there had been much more regular autopsies carried out, much more detail understood about the body, then yes. But even into the end of the 1700s, there was less understanding of all the details of how the body worked. And so people were definitely less aware of what was a safe amount of blood to remove from a body.
So it could have been that in 1700s and before they accidentally removed too much. Whereas when you get into the time of like autopsies and understanding how much blood the body has, that would have lessened.
Absolutely. I would definitely say yes to that. There was definitely a risk of removing too much, and their understanding of what too much meant, say in the 1400s or 1500s, would be very different. They wouldn't be thinking of it in the same way that we do. So they would be thinking about the humoral balance in the body, the idea that there are four humors that need to be kept in balance. So when they were talking about removing too much blood, they were thinking, oh, well, the ratio of blood to black bile
Yeah.
would be the wrong ratio. So what they understood by removing too much was in a different context to what we would think of as removing too much.
Yeah.
So both of these bowls that we have on display are made of metal, but there are plenty of other things that bleeding bowls are made from at different points. So the earliest ones that survive were stone or pottery, and that's really going back to Roman times. It was only really in the 1700s that they were made from metal as standard. But even then, there were variations, and quite a lot of French bleeding bowls were made of porcelain. And you can see these online. They're very intricately and beautifully painted. That was much less common in Britain, but much more normal or commonly found in France. And of course, if you're very wealthy, there are, very, very fancy ornate ones. Our high end is brass, but that's not anywhere near the precious metals and ornately carved ones that you would get. I feel like those are less practical though, because the more ornately carved it is, the more places there are for bits of blood to get stuck.
Yeah, like you don't want dried, fisty blood all over your bleeding bowl.
I do not.
If you're gonna get bled, you want a nice clean bleeding bowl.
Bleeding continues much longer than we often think of it as doing so. So into, the 1910s, 1920s, there are still bleeding bowls being manufactured. At that point, they're more often made from steel or enamel. But yes, bleeding is still carried out. Not for everything. In earlier periods, bleeding is almost it's a panacea. It's used for almost every single condition they think bleeding will help with. Whereas when you get into the 20th century, it's more specific. So pneumonia is one condition that people are commonly bled for. There are a few others as well. But yeah, it's more targeted. But yes, bloodletting still exists. And bloodletting is still used today, but in very, very specific contexts.
I think that's really surprising. I don't think I'll be the only person that's surprised that bloodletting is still going on and that it was going on in like the 20th century. You don't think of a bloodletting bowl being made of enamel. That is a modern material.
Absolutely. And I think now this is getting into territory that I'm very shaky on because current medicine is not my skill set. But there are definitely companies which produce medical grade leeches, which can be used in healthcare safely. Medical grade leeches are, as I understand it, ones that are bred in captivity. So you don't want what they used to do, which was go out to a swamp and pick up some leeches. You don't know where that leech has been and what it's done and what it's been sucking on or whatever.
Yeah, it's just sucked the blood of a deer that was infected with something, and now it's gonna get stuck to you.
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.